Test, test.
I'll give you a signal once everyone comes in. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, they're going to pop up. Okay, that's pretty good. I never tried that until. And without any further ado, I would try that. so. I'm actually sitting there. I'm sorry, what? Oh, we can move it, yeah, but I'm going to have to sit there after. Oh, okay, thank you. I was actually going to move it here anyway. Are you live streaming?
Yes.
Oh, you sold out. See, I didn't live stream mine until it sold out. I'm like, why? Because I figured for next year if there's some market.
Right.
Because you can do it on demand.
I didn't mention it, but I didn't mention it until it was sold out.
Exactly.
By the way.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Congratulations, sold out. So at the end, I'm going to go in the back. I'll grab the other mic. So when you point to people with questions, I'll walk to them.
Felix do that.
Huh?
You don't have to do that.
Well, if Felix grabs it, fine.
He'll do it.
I didn't know if he was going to do that. He's good at that.
Later. I promise.
sent to the corner in elementary school, and you did something you didn't get
I
caught.
deserve it. I
And you
totally
did something and you didn't get caught in.
I totally deserve it.
I've never seen a solar town with so many people walking. Interesting about their age. Really.
But at the same time, I'm glad there's a bunch of kids here too.
Yeah.
It should be interesting because I'm telling you, I let an off-color joke fairly early on.
And if there's anybody in the audience, you'll point them out that you know, yourself you want to point out. Any publishers or anything like that? Okay. In case I forget, first thing I do is ask them to silence the cell phones. Okay, welcome to the Internationally Famous Explorers Club. Okay. All right, first may I please ask you to make sure you silence your cell phones. So I'm Chris. I silence the cell phones, not the speaker. Okay, I'm Chris Nicola, sometimes referred to as the caving guy here at the club. I like to think it's because of my prowess of exploring caves, rather than some saying that I look like I crawl out from under a rock, especially after the after party of our annual dinner. So, apart from that, shortly you're going to hear from our guest speaker tonight, Stephen Schwacker, an award-winning writer and editor with 25 years' experience in Greater China. I should mention at one time, Stephen was the chapter chair of the largest chapter of the Explorers Club out of Beijing. His club consisted or encompassed 10 time zones. So I remember him telling me it was always kind of hard to have weekly or monthly meetings. But anyway, 25 years experience in Greater China, focusing on exploration, technology, and culture. He is the co-creator of The Six, a book and documentary project about Chinese passengers aboard the RMS Titanic. Now, with that, some personal notes. I've known Stephen for quite some time, and I like to say I'm even prouder now of my association with him than when I was first introduced to Steve in this very room many, many years ago by a living legend at the time, Peter Hess, a living legend in the diving world. And Peter came up to Stephen and I, we didn't know each other, he said, "You two guys need to talk. You got something in common." And we did, and we found out what we have in common. Stephen has the ability to bring up stories from the past that would have got lost in the dark abyss of forgotten histories, and make the people involved who were faced with insurmountable odds, doing extraordinary things to survive, and show the world that they mattered, they were here. They had an effect. And in the process of doing that and bringing them back to life, he also joined families together. He brought family members together, not only to remember their ancestors, but also to honor them in their amazing, courageous feats. And without any further ado, and he did that in The Six, just as he did with his previous book, Poseidon, about a British submarine that went down with 18 sailors aboard. He brought these people back to life. He showed the world that their stories counted and made a difference. And without any further ado, I'd like to introduce my longtime friend and fellow Explorers Club member, Stephen Schwacker.
Thank you so much. I forgot my tie this evening, so I'll wear Chris's instead. So Chris has totally oversold me and took up all my time, so if there's any questions, I'll just... All right, so welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for being here tonight. It's really amazing to see so many, both members and non-members. Welcome, members of the public. I hope you enjoy. If this is your first trip to the Explorers Club, I hope it's the first of many. So, for our viewers at home, I'm going to wax nostalgic for just a few minutes, so if you want to put a little more butter on your popcorn, feel free to do that. So, you know, this is a year of big anniversaries. It's the 40th anniversary of the discovery of Titanic. That will take place in September. And it's also the 40th anniversary of the first time that I sat in this room, very much like you are tonight. And I sat over here somewhere, and I was 15 years old, and I was here with my dad, and my father wasn't a member at that time. And I remember sitting in this room and thinking, geez, what would it take to join a club like this? And I never imagined that that period of time later, I'd be addressing an audience about something I did about Titanic. So this is a little bit humbling. Not to mention that my friend Chris and my friend Peter Hess is honored with a plaque at the far window. And Peter, I always wish you were here. So last thing I'll say about that is, this is probably the third or fourth time that I've had the honor of speaking from this podium. And, you always hope that there's going to be another time, but you never know, if it's really going to happen, if your work is going to reach that level, did you do something, or maybe you went out on expedition and you didn't come back. So, it's always a very special occasion to be here. So thank you again. So tonight I want to talk about further explorations of the Titanic. So tonight is Titanic Eve, let's call it. Right now, 113 years ago, people were sitting down to dinner, whether it was in first class, second class, third class, and who knows what they thought at that time, but I'm sure they didn't anticipate what was about to happen. And I'm sure that they didn't think that 113 years later we would be still talking about that voyage and still talking about it in the way that we do now. The Titanic remains the alpha and omega of shipwrecks. It's just the shipwreck that we think about when we first hear the term. And there have been bigger ones, greater loss of life, potentially ones that are more significant to history, but it is still the name that stays with us. So one thing that I think is important is that we remember always that Titanic is a story of tragedy. Okay? No matter what we talk about tonight in terms of technology, culture, pop culture, the way forward, ultimately this is a tragic story. Almost 1,500 people lost their lives that night, and we can never forget that. That really needs to remain at the forefront of any discussion that we choose to conduct about Titanic itself. So I remember a number of years ago, a friend of mine and I, we were just talking about the topics, the pop culture topics that that people continue to embrace or have an interest in from generation to generation. And I remember that he said, late at night, when I've got the remote in my hand and I'm watching television, I'm only stopping for one of two things: Titanic or Hitler. Okay? So the statement that I just made contains a little white lie, because actually what he said wasn't Titanic. It started with the same three letters, and it was a plural, but I think the idea was there, so I'm going to go with that, okay? It's a family audience tonight. So Titanic and Hitler are just, they're just the kind of things that get remade again and again. Luckily, we're seeing a drop-off in the latter topic, but Titanic remains strong as a topic. And so, let's take a look at why that is. Should it be that important? Should people still be interested in it? And if they are, then, is there a way to channel that in a very positive way from a tragic event? So just last week, we had this article in the New York Times, and it's nice to see we have some younger folks here tonight. So you think you know a lot about the Titanic? Have you asked a 5-year-old lately? Well, no, I haven't, but clearly the Times did. They asked a 10-year-old, and what did they find that he was interested in? I really like whenever it just cracked open in half and then sank and then just fell apart into the Atlantic Ocean. I mean, there's a lot to be excited about Titanic. I don't think the cracking in half and falling into the Atlantic Ocean part is really what I would want, the next generation to embrace. But, and then if you read below, he and his father have designed the tubtastic Titanic bath toy, which sells 200 per month. So that's definitely my stocking stuffer for this year. So in any case, one of the places where Titanic, or where we have an opportunity with Titanic, is indeed to inspire a new generation. At the time that Titanic was discovered in September 1985, it was more or less the edge of what we were able to do in terms of undersea exploration, in terms of using ROVs, in terms of using multi-beam sonar. It really kind of led the way, and it inspired a whole generation to decide that that was something that they could do, that they wanted to do. It wasn't, in some ways, it was a bit of a moonshot. It was an Apollo mission in its own right. It made people think, gee, maybe we can explore the deep ocean. I remember when I was about 13, which was a couple years before Titanic was discovered, thinking, they'll never find that. It's just, the ocean's too deep, it's too vast, there's no way to do it. And then, prove me wrong. But I think it shows that there's an opportunity for a new generation to embrace the technology that's available and then employ it for deep sea exploration. So Titanic is really moving in two directions for us, okay? On the one hand, we are moving away from Titanic. All of the survivors are gone. In many cases, even their children are gone. So the opportunity for a first-hand or even a second-hand account has disappeared. That's time working against us. We can come up with better technology to overcome deep water and currents and cold and all kinds of things, but we still haven't figured out a way how to stop time or how to reverse it or how to address it in a way other than going forward. So on the one hand, we have that working against us. Working for us, we do have the improving technology, meaning we can do 8K scans of the wreck now. We can create micro robots that can go inside the hull in a non-invasive or a less invasive way. We have AI tools that we haven't even really begun to apply yet. We're really just starting to look at what could we possibly do more? What else could we investigate with this new technology? It seems like every year at this time, we always wonder, well, what's going to be next? What's going to be the new special? I mean, this year, 113th anniversary, it's kind of an off year. It's kind of an off anniversary. It's not a big one like 100 or 125. And yet this year we have National Geographic debuting the digital resurrection, which was just showing in the bar downstairs if you were paying attention. One of the things we'll come back to that in a second. One of the things about Titanic is, why are we still fixated on this ship from 1912? This is the icon of the seas, which is the largest ship in the world right now, and it is many times larger than Titanic was. This holds 7,600 people. It's many, many times heavier. For comparison, this graphic is so bad it looks like I did it, but this really gives you, when you think about it, Titanic was the largest moving object when it was completed. That's amazing. But now, if you go down to the Jersey Shore and you see the big ships that go out, the big cruise ships that are going down to Florida and the Caribbean on a Friday night, they're many times larger. So, we like to think that a disaster like Titanic will not happen again in the current age, but imagine if something went wrong to Icon of the Seas. I'm not wishing that by any means, but it just, the opportunity for disaster now is so much greater, and yet we're still fixated on this event from over 100 years ago. So, one of the issues that I'll discuss a little later is should we be involved in salvage? Should we save the Titanic? Obviously, when this movie was made based on Clive Cussler's book, we didn't know that the wreck had broken up and that it was in pieces. There was still this idea that you could raise the Titanic whole and salvage it and so forth. And to be honest, there are still people who believe that. There are still people that believe that we should try to bring up the bow, that maybe we have the technology, and that we should save everything that we can save. There is, of course, a counter-argument, which is that we should leave it where it is. It's time to let Titanic rest, and once and for all, we should just let it go. That the technology gives us the opportunity now to create reasonable duplicates, reasonable twins, and that we don't need to go there anymore, especially in the wake of the Titan submarine accident, which obviously had a huge effect on this club. that it's just time to let it go. That we've enjoyed Titanic's company for 40 years now, and maybe it's time to give it a rest. So for the digital resurrection, by the way, digital resurrection is just such a metal title. I mean, I could only hope that I only saw a little bit of it earlier, but I just hope that Bruce Dickinson from Iron Maiden narrates it. I mean, it's just a digital resurrection, So. It's just such a cool thing. But it really shows where the technology is now. We have these 8K scans of the wreck, and people are making discoveries from the scans themselves. That's really where the opportunity lies. It's one thing to say, well, we can do this, and that's lovely. It's nice to test the technology out, but to actually apply it and come away with it being able to solve mysteries and to be able to do so without having to risk life and limb, to go down there and examine it, that I think is the real opportunity. You have this is a shot from Digital Resurrection. Now you have these wire models and the breakup and just the way the debris has fallen down, and then tracing the debris almost from the surface down to the debris field on the ocean floor. And the detail now is really amazing, and it begs the question of us, what are we still going for? What else can we discover? So one of the other opportunities is virtual reality, doing virtual reality walkthroughs of the ship, virtual reality models. This is not a great screen grab from a documentary we did called The Six about the Chinese passengers, and this is a staircase. This is a third-class staircase going up. So my co-creator, Arthur Jones, absolutely despises when I use this phrase, which is why I'm going to use it again. But in the Robert De Niro movie Ronin, he's looking at a map and he says, the map is not the territory. And that's something that I believe in very, very strongly. And if you look at Titanic's deck plans and you're trying to figure out where passengers are escaping from or how they escaped, it looks like they could have gone anywhere. It looks like they could have gone all the way to the stern. They could have gone up to Scotland Road and gone all the way back to the stern and so forth. But by doing an early, this was, 9 years ago, by doing an early virtual reality walkthrough of the ship, we were able to realize, no, they can't walk all the way to the back, because where our men were on F or G deck, as soon as the accident took place, the watertight doors dropped down, and then suddenly they really have no options except this staircase. And there's no way we would have known that unless we were able to walk through the wreck. So I think virtual reality especially brings things down to a personal level. The outside scans, that's great, and wreckage and the iceberg and so forth. But ultimately, when it comes to telling the personal stories, it's tools like this that are going to give people a chance to really move through the wreck, move through the ship themselves, and start to see things the way that passengers did, officers did. What was their way out? How would they have gotten up? And how would that have affected the decisions that they made along the way? One of the reasons that Titanic has survived so long is because, let's face it, especially since the James Cameron film, we all picture ourselves on Titanic. Okay, we've all had that moment. It's okay. We've all had that, well, I would have stepped back from the rail. I would have done what Astor did, or I would have stayed with my husband and gone down with the ship. We all think those thoughts. We all think about what we would have done if we were in that position. And I think now that we have virtual reality opportunities to actually go through the ship and perhaps even to feel fear or at least trepidation about, this pathway is flooded. This gate is locked. This lifeboat is gone. It may change the way that we feel about it overall, and it may give us a better understanding of the passengers and the officers and their decisions on the night. So this is the new, the VR, it's the ROV fly-through or flyover. I haven't messed with it at all because, have a job and stuff, and I just can't quit the job to become a VR pilot. But again, it's a fascinating look at, I mean, who thought that we would be able to do this from our big desktops and our monitors and so forth? I mean, it's just amazing stuff. And again, there's the opportunity for discovery to be made within this. Now, I don't know if I want to look like this when I'm exploring Titanic, but, the technology will get better over time. And I'm sorry, was that not fair? Come on. So, another set of tools that we've only really begun to apply are our AI tools. Now, this is my favorite bot, which I never, ever use at work, called Claude, CLAUDE.ai. It's wonderful. Try the free version. I recommend it highly. But, one of the advantages that we have now is that unlike people at the time, even if you go back to the time of Walter Lord when he was writing A Night to Remember, we have the advantage of immediacy. And what I mean by that is we are getting to the point where we can check a whole number of accounts or a whole number of facts very quickly and side by side, okay? So we don't need to, if we're comparing somebody's testimony versus a letter that someone wrote in 1961, if we're trying to get multiple accounts together to understand what happened at a certain point in the sinking, now with AI, we can start to bring those together all side by side at the same time. You could do it now, but it would just be so much more labor intensive. You'd have to kind of lay it out all on a table or something. But AI is really kind of at a point where it can do the thinking for us. It's not, for historical research, I would say it's not really there yet. But something to look forward to in the next 5 years is being able to compare, really create a solid timeline and see what different people are saying about the same event simultaneously. And I think that will start to reveal a lot about passenger experiences and officer experiences and so forth. So, of course, I asked Claude about this, and you can read it for yourself, but it just talked about. But it wished us, what did it say? It's cut off a little bit at the bottom, but I really liked what it said. It said, "I wish you enlightening discussion this evening at the Explorers Club. May your curiosity remain boundless and your exploration thoughtful." Well, thank you, Claude. That's so nice. I'm not sure I could have said it better myself. So a few years from now, on the next Titanic anniversary, Claude will be here to present for you. But I think, again, this is, the advantage that the technology gives us to look at things in a way that it's, as I said, on the one hand, we're kind of moving away from the event in terms of time and firsthand accounts and so forth. But really, our satellite technology, our ability to look at things from high up, and I don't mean the surface, but just being able to look at all the material at the same time. When you meet some of the folks in the Titanic community who are really the experts, people like Tad Fitch and J. Kent Layton and Bill Wormstead, you can just see that they're carrying around these libraries of Titanic information in their head. And you say, oh, well, when Lifeboat 7, no, it's Lifeboat 9. And they just know it. And it's like, oh, But that's really why they're the experts, because they've read everything and they've looked at everything. Over time, these tools will allow us to have a similar view. So it's something that can only really lead to greater understanding, if not greater discovery. All right, so I'm going to wade into the salvage, no salvage discussion, and for my own safety, not express an opinion. But we're really at a point where this is not just a philosophical point, but we are at a place where we really kind of need to make a decision about, do we want to recover anything more from the wreck? Should we? And then if we are, then what are we going to do? What do we want to do with it? What's the point? So this is what's known as the big piece. It's at the Luxor in Las Vegas. This isn't my photo. I've never seen it in person. But this was picked up from the ocean floor a number of years ago. It was not ripped from the side of the wreck. It had been ripped off during the disintegration. Excuse me. So you can pay to go see it. I gather it's very impressive that people just are amazed by the size of it and that they get to actually stand there and stare at rivets from the wreck and really, see what a piece of the wreck looked like. I think even 10 years ago, we would have had a different discussion about salvage. And I'm not talking about just Titanic salvage, but, we're at a point where, for example, our neighbors down the street, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where the ownership, who should own artifacts, who should recover artifacts, and who gets to keep them, is really at a boiling point. You're starting to see artifacts from, let's say, ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, ancient Iraq, ancient China, and you're seeing countries make compelling arguments for why those items should be returned to their country of national sovereignty. So the question about, who owns a particular thing is really increasing. I think at the root of it really is, why do we value things? Should we value things? Why do we value things? And then what do we value? On the one hand, now with the quality of the scans that we're getting off the wreck, if you wanted to 3D print something, it's probably difficult, but you could do it. If you wanted to create a replica of something, a meaningful replica, a useful replica that could be used for some kind of research, you could do it. But then the question is, doesn't that make the original article even more valuable? Then does that not fuel, the desire for salvage or the desire to display it? Or, again, well, I do have an opinion on it, but I don't really want to express an opinion on it, but because I think it's a question. Courts have been wrestling with this for years, specifically in relation to Titanic. Countries are now wrestling with this in regards to Titanic and other wrecks. Anytime a treasure ship shows up anywhere, suddenly, a bunch of people that weren't looking for it suddenly lay a claim to it. But the question is, if we were to go back to Titanic at this point to recover anything, is there anything specific that we should attempt to recover? And then who's going to get it? What are we going to do with it? And I would just say this, think back to all the things that have inspired your curiosity over the years. Think about things you saw in museums. A lot of us went to see the treasures of Tutankhamun when we were younger. It even goes so far as to, dolphins that we saw at SeaWorld when we were little. And maybe we don't love those things now, but really they changed the direction of our lives. They inspired us. And I wonder if virtual copies, whether they're visual virtual copies or whether they're physical copies, whether they will inspire people in the same way, whether they will inspire the next generation of explorer in the next way, in the same way. So I think it's a question worth pondering, but it's something that we should really ponder quite quickly, because the wreck isn't going to be there forever. And given the conditions that it exists in, the potential that parts of it are going to start coming down. I know that the divers in the room certainly have seen the Andrea Doria start to collapse over years, and things get destroyed. There was a lot of talk about going to get the Marconi radio, and then that was eventually, called off. So I think it's a question that's worth us pondering. If we're going to talk about Titanic as this iconic shipwreck, then are we going to take anything more from it? Who has the authority to do that? Who has the authority to oppose it? Are there family groups that can oppose it aside from legal entities? What should we do with it, and where should we go with it? And I think I'll leave it at that. The rusticles themselves are starting to take their toll. One way that Titanic really has not been used is as a living laboratory, and I think that's really an opportunity. Sure, it's deep and dark, but it is a fixed place. That's really one of the great things about Titanic, is that it is a very well documented fixed point, both in the ocean and in history. So in terms of measuring temperature rises. In this case, you have this particular species of bacteria that creates these rusticles. It's a fixed point, and it's something that everyone can relate to. I realize it's kind of cold and deep and far, but as a fixed point, it works very well both in terms of history and in terms of it's where it exists physically. So we're in a different landscape now than we have been. Again, even 10 years ago, we would not have talked about the influence of, for example, podcasts or user-generated media to fuel this legend of and this interest in Titanic. I think after James Cameron's film, if you go to a school now and you ask, hey, how many people have seen James Cameron's movie, the only person who's going to raise their hand is the teacher. Okay, unless you're a Titanic enthusiast and you've introduced your kids to Jack and Rose, it's just not the same kind of cultural touch point that it once was. And yet, we have the New York Times writing about why 5-year-olds are interested in the Titanic breaking up and sinking to the ocean floor. So part of that is that we have a whole new generation of media that is sustaining the interest. Okay, if you were in Long Beach, California this weekend, you could have gone to Titanic Legacy Weekend. These kinds of gatherings are still going on, and there's a whole new generation of people who just love the story, are interested in the technology, they just love everything about it. And there's Unsinkable, the Titanic podcast. There's Titanic Talk with Nelson Aspin and Alexandra Boyd. Alexandra Boyd was in the film. She was in the James Cameron film. She just did a wonderful documentary called Ship of Dreams. I mean, that's another example. Now you have documentaries not about the ship itself and not even about the film, but about the making of the film, or like the making of the film. The interest is just, Titanic is just an orange that we're determined to squeeze every single drop of juice out of. So there's Titanic Talk Line, which is a Titanic call-in show. There's Titanic Legacy, which again just had the gathering out in Long Beach on the Queen Mary of all. By the way, Queen Mary and Titanic, the best Titanic movie that you'll see, because I know when you go home tonight you're going to want to watch a Titanic movie. Watch Titanic 666. It's absolutely hilarious. It's just, I'll just feed you this one line. Look at the ship. It's free. It's, you don't have to subscribe to anything. It's, but it just shows you the media mania that surrounds Titanic. So, and finally, there's Titanic New Jersey. And to all 4 of my listeners, I promise new episodes are coming soon. Okay, so. All right. What I think ultimately drives the interest in Titanic, and what will always drive the interest in Titanic, except for a very limited group of rivet heads, is the personal stories. This is one of my. I'm not a Titanic generalist. I got into it. It was. When you grow up on the Jersey Shore, like, shipwrecks are part of your life. They're just out there. Titanic is out there. Andrea Doria is out there. They're just around. If you have any interest in diving, you're going to Beneath the Sea. You're going to Boston Sea Rovers. You're hearing people talk about these things. You're sitting next to Emery Kristoff, who operated the ROV on the first expeditions. It's just part of the landscape. It's part of our backyard. So, to me, that just shipwreck stories were always just around. It was just part of what was out there. And so, like I said, I'm not really a generalist, but still lots of aspects of the stories always appealed to me. This is, I believe this is supposed to be a photo of Captain Smith. I think more recently there's been some question as to whether it is or is not him. But this was taken by an Irish priest that sailed from Southampton to Queenstown, and then got off and didn't make the fateful voyage. That's also nomadic, the tender off to the side there, which you can still go visit in Belfast. But I think it's these stories, and again, the people's desire to put themselves into the story that really is going to keep it going forward. And therefore, our understanding of the genuine stories of Titanic and its passengers, its crew, its makers, all the people that are around it, that's really what's going to drive us forward. And, as I said, we now have better, let's call it satellite view. We have a better top view of things. We have better access to research. You can do so much more from your desktop instead of having to go to an archive in a different country or in a different city. And I think that's really going to continue to propel the story, continue to propel the legacy of Titanic forward. For example, there's a book came out a few years ago called The Black Man on Titanic. All right, so probably not something you necessarily thought about before. This is Joseph LaRouche. I believe he was originally from Haiti. He was the only black passenger on board, and he did not survive. He was a second-class passenger. Here he is with his wife and his 2 children. But, he did not survive the journey. And this is the kind of story, there were plenty of stories before about, and, no disrespect to my Irish ancestors, but, we had a lot of stories about Irish villagers and folks from Northern Europe and from the US, and certainly the first class was very well documented. But it was sort of the other folks in the background, or the background of most of the movies that we didn't really pay that much attention to. One of the most fascinating is the Middle Eastern passengers on Titanic. Again, probably not a group that a whole lot of people knew about or thought about. This book, by the way, if you have it, is a real collector's item. So, if you want to make a couple of bucks on eBay, this is definitely the one to go with. But Layla Saloom Elias, who has written a whole bunch of books about the Arab-American experience, wrote this one about the Syrians on board. It also covers a bit about the Lebanese and the Turkish passengers. And they have a fascinating story that is quite different from the accounts of other passengers. Many of the Middle Eastern passengers, or many of their descendants at least, have a real belief that their relatives or that their friends were killed by Titanic's crew, that they were shot to death trying to board lifeboats. Now, I'll let you read it for yourself. You can make up your mind whether you believe those accounts or not. It brings into a lot of aspects of very controversial aspects of the Titanic story, like, did the officers use guns against passengers? More so than just firing in the air to scare people out of lifeboats. But it's really a fascinating read, and it's a completely different look at the Titanic experience. And will we ever be able to prove definitively whether that happened or not? Remains to be seen. There's really no phrase that I despise more than lost to history. That's just, to me, that's synonymous with I give up. And so, maybe someday, I still believe with my whole heart that there are photographs from Titanic before the sinking. I absolutely believe that they must exist. Don't say that on a Titanic message board, you get shouted down, but there's no reason why they shouldn't exist. Whether they exist or not is a different story, but they certainly could exist, let's put it that way. But yeah, it's stories like this that, where there's really room for investigation. And then, of course, I had the privilege of, at least for a while, becoming the custodian of the stories of the Chinese passengers. So there were 8 Chinese passengers on Titanic. There were a total of 9 Asian passengers. There was also a Japanese passenger in second class. He survived. And then along with our 8 Chinese passengers, 6 of them survived, which we found to be a small sample size, but a very high survival rate. It was just something that it just tweaked me, and it bothered me. I was supposed to be working on another shipwreck story, another China shipwreck story, and the shortcut that we were going to use to talk about that particular maritime disaster without having to go into a lot of background was that we were just going to compare it to Titanic. That was simple. We knew that the audience in China would understand that reference. We knew that the global audience would understand that reference. And so we thought, okay, we'll compare it to Titanic. So I went back to my shelf. I started to reread the classics like A Night to Remember and, On a Sea of Glass, and also look at some of the material that was online. And when I finally came across this information, and I know I had seen it before, I know that I knew that there had been Chinese passengers on Titanic, but there was so little about them. There was some mentions by J. Bruce Ismay in his testimony about their existence, a few slanderous remarks about how they had acted on the night, and that was about it. And so probably the first time, like everybody else, I just clicked on to the next topic. This time it really bothered me. We know so much about so many of Titanic's passengers, and yet 6 out of these 8 men survived, and we really know nothing about them. How is that possible? So when the 100th anniversary came around in 2012, I thought for sure somebody would put up their hand and say, my grandfather was a passenger on Titanic, a Chinese passenger on Titanic. And there was just nothing out there, and I thought it's just not possible. And we have to go find them. And so, it took a lot of, I would say we were partially successful. For those of you who remember the Leonard Nimoy show In Search Of, we offer the best possible explanation. Yeah, let's hear it for Leonard Nimoy. We tried to offer, we took each story as far as it could possibly go. That meant that in one case, we found one of the survivors, the gentleman on the center left, we found his son in Wisconsin. I can tell you that the youngest great-grandchild, the youngest Titanic great-grandchild in the world was born about 6 months ago. So in some cases, the relations are still quite close. But we were able to trace him all the way from from the island where he was born in southern China to Chicago and then Wisconsin and then ultimately back to Chicago via Titanic, via New York. On the right, the younger fellow, he probably wasn't on Titanic, excuse me, but his father or uncle definitely was, ran a restaurant in Ontario, and then disappeared right around the time of the Second World War. On the right, we had Alam, who was the oldest of the crew, and he was a lifelong sailor, and unfortunately we weren't able to trace him beyond his departure from Liverpool in the 20s. And then on the far left-hand side is Ling He. He deserted from a ship in India in about 1920, and then we weren't able to trace him any further. We had 6 survivors. We only even got photos of 4 of them. So, but the story that we were able to, not only does their story shine a light on various parts of the Titanic experience, including that 4 of them escaped on the same boat as J. Bruce Ismay, that one of them was plucked from the water, and that his survival inspired the Jack and Rose ending of the James Cameron film. Those kinds of things, they were sitting there waiting for somebody to investigate them. And my partner Arthur Jones and I happened to wander into a very dusty corner of Titanic history, and we were rewarded with their stories and the ability to tell them. So, just when we think we know everything about Titanic, I would say that maybe we should look again. It's worth looking at. It's certainly a story that people think maybe has been told a bit too much, but I would argue that as long as Titanic remains a touch point for underwater exploration, for historical research, and as a way to inspire the next generation to take up the mantle and to embrace the new technology and to reevaluate those stories in a new way, then I think it remains a very valid topic. So that's the book. Again, it's the photos, and it's available now at fine bookstores near you. So thank you very much. Any questions? Wait for the microphone. Yes.
Wonderful talk. Thank you. Just for your consideration, Yeah, I'll be very brief. I think you may be selling short the value of the Titanic story as a teachable moment in human history, and that the individual stories and Cameron's fictional accounts are compelling, but that the lasting value of the Titanic and salvaging pieces to hold on to is the unsinkable aspect of it. 2 years prior to World War I, it is presaging everything that happened in the 20th century and continues until now in terms of hubris, and that the maintaining the story and its vitality is such a teaching tool for the future that we ought to take that into account in terms of how we deal with what, as we say, is a grave site, basically. That there has to be an understanding that there is such an ethical imperative to keeping this story alive as to what it teaches to us up until what happened 2 years ago in Newfoundland.
I would agree. I mean, it's, why are we still so excited about dinosaurs? Why are we still so excited about sharks? Why are we still, it's just, it draws people, especially younger people, in. And if that gets them started on something, and they learn to love nature, they learn to love science, they learn to love history, then whatever it takes, And I hope that there's not another tragedy that replaces Titanic in the same way. I'm fine with Titanic being replaced as that teachable moment. I just hope that a whole lot of people don't need to lose their lives to do that.
I was under the impression that you were going to speak tonight somewhat about sunken vessels as artificial reefs, but you didn't, and I wondered whether you'd tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, I mean, the artificial reef concept goes on. I mean, with the world, I think it's going to be the world's largest. When the SS United States is sunk in time for July 4th of next year. I mean, it's a program that has certainly been largely successful, provided that whatever's being sunk to be the reef is sufficiently clean when it goes down. That's one of the problems with, let's call them natural shipwrecks, which is, they're loaded with oil and loaded with all kinds of chemicals and nasty stuff. There certainly is, they create an opportunity for tourism in many cases, a nice eco-tourism. The USS Oriskany is down off of, I'm sorry, Mary, somewhere in Florida. Thank you. And, the United States is going to perform the same role. Titanic obviously was not intended as an artificial reef, but any artificial reef gives us the opportunity to establish a point on the sea bottom that we can then use as a platform to measure anything, currents, water temperature changes, salinity levels, levels of wildlife. They attract wildlife both for fishermen and for divers. So I think so far it's been pretty successful. There have been a couple places off New Jersey where they didn't quite do it right, and so it's a little bit messy. But overall, it's something that probably will continue, especially in the face of declining coral reefs. So.
What have you learned that we might not have learned if we didn't have artificial reefs?
I mean, it's any kind of, having a situation that's controlled like that, where you can measure coral growth or other growth of flora and fauna. How fish populations congregate around those kinds of objects. We knew about those things before anecdotally, because fishermen would realize that they were catching more fish around wrecks right up until the moment that the wreck caught their net, and then they didn't do that anymore. So, but doing it in a planned way, in a planned, clean eco-friendly way is certainly an advance. And now you're seeing more. It's less about ships, acquiring old ships to be. Now you're seeing 3D printed coral being put in place in areas, or coral being grown in labs and then replaced. So it's something. To be honest, it's something where we don't really have a choice. It's something that we need to be doing more of.
So I thought that maybe one word to add to the discussion of value is a word that we've been using in preservation for a long time, which is authenticity. And I feel that the big piece which sits in Vegas is also an ethical question. And I feel like this, we talk about it bubbling up and bubbling over, you talk about, but I think this question of authenticity and value has been going on for a long, long time. The British argued with the Italians when they wanted to rebuild San Marco and all these things in the 1900s. And there's a lot of arguments back and forth about what's authentic. Is something authentic if you clean it, if you replace it, if you restore it? So I think I would just add that one thing, the authenticity, when we look at these, adds to the ethics debate. Should we be valuing something that's completely inauthentic, is not in the place it should be, has been removed from the place? But then also in preservation, you see Nefertiti's tomb is now being scanned, and now tourists are able to go to a scanned version of Nefertiti's tomb so that they don't damage the existing ones. So there's good parts and bad parts to scanning and authenticity. But I think that's the discussion that needs to be added to value, and just something to say. Thank you.
Indeed, and authenticity, of course, is the hipster's favorite word. But it's a good argument because there are a lot of wonderful forces at work. I mean, we're at a time in history when there's a lot of shouting and not so much dialogue. But it's really good that various forces are pushing back and forth against one another, because I think that ultimately will give us the best possible solution. And of course, those things change over time. 20 years ago, when you started talking about returning this object or that object, people were like, yeah, no, we're not going to do that. But now it's a completely different conversation, and people realize that they don't necessarily want to be on the wrong side of history, and the side of history changes over time. So I agree with you. It's one of the things that we need to consider when we decide what it is that we want to do with Titanic going forward.
Using this as a tool moving forward, we saw 3D models and scans of the Titanic. You mentioned people being able to experience the escape from Titanic. What did the officers and the passengers go through from each compartment? Your evaluation of the deck plans, and it looked like there were safe exits, but turns out there weren't. Are there any tools or motions moving forward to use these sorts of escape plans to train young maritime officers today, even current passengers on ships, more efficient escape plans? How do we design the ships better so that there isn't the same confusion? How do we make the next generation safer or better?
I will admit that I don't know of them off the top of my head, but I would imagine that there is, because even 10 years ago you had software that could model the movements of crowds within ships that were sinking under various conditions. I hope I'm not bursting anybody's bubble, but Titanic is not the worst maritime disaster in history. It's the Wilhelm Gustloff, which was a German ship that went down in January 1945, sometime 1945. It was torpedoed and went down with about 8,000 or 9,000 people, and so the software that I saw was used to model like how people would have attempted to move through the ship, and how they might have made an escape and so forth. I mean, when you consider the sophistication of the average flight simulator now, just on the desktop, and then when you compare it to what's actually being used to train airline pilots, there's absolutely no reason why people wouldn't do that. So yeah, I mean, it makes perfect sense. But especially in the on something like the Icon of the Seas, I mean, how interested is the average passenger in their own? I mean, think about it this way. Last time you were on a plane, did you read the safety card? I mean, really, you know, it's like, do people really like look for their life preserver? And so it's great, you know, obviously we should have drills. It should be on the back of the door. It should be on the card, and we should all read it. And, you know, the reality is that, you know, how many people are going to stand around and go through a VR drill, you know, when they could be on a water slide or drinking a margarita, or, you know, that's why they went on the cruise in the first place. So,
Okay,
yeah, but I mean, absolutely valid.
Okay, I've been given the signal. We have time for one last question, but I'd like to remind everybody that Steve will be available outside signing books and probably can answer more questions. So with that, this last question.
All right. One very brief comment and question. My comment is, it resonated with the part about the 5-year-old you had at the beginning. So it was actually the Titanic story that inspired me to make a career out of sailing for a living. So I've been doing that 20 years, so much to become captain of a ship of a similar size. So it was the Titanic story, so please keep spreading the news. And my question is, totally unrelated, are there other ethnicities that might not yet have been or received the amount of attention deserved on the Titanic that we don't know about, or maybe just haven't received that attention yet?
That's a great question. I think that despite Layla's wonderful work on the Middle Eastern passengers, I think probably they could take another. I mean, I hope somebody picks up our research on the Chinese passengers and takes it forward. I think any group is, you know, if someone feels that they can make a contribution, they absolutely should, and especially if they're going to apply new technology to it. There's just so much that's potentially still out there. There are still so many attics that are loaded with letters and photos and you know, trinkets and so forth. And frankly, there are a whole lot of Titanic collectors who are holding their collections back and not making them available to researchers. They're hanging on to them in a very selfish and meaningless way. Sorry to raise my voice a little bit there, but you know, it's you know, it's great to have a collection. I used to collect baseball cards and Hess trucks and all those good things, but you know, we're talking about a subject that's of public value, and you know, those things should at least be made available to researchers. In terms of who else should be looked at, I mean, you know, for example, one of the things that made the Chinese passenger survival story stand out is that all the Austro-Hungarians on board died. And I think there were 33 of them. There were 33 or 49 Bulgarians that all went down with the ship. So, you know, in contrast to the Chinese men's survival success, what led to all of them? I mean, 33 is a big number, you know, 49 is a big number. These are, you know, what can account for this entire group, you know, going down? So I think things like that, you know, really lend themselves to further investigation.
Okay, on that note, I'd like to thank Steve, one of my role models and heroes. And one last comment about how these shipwrecks are still affecting us today. I have a number of things on my bucket list, and one was to visit the USS United States, which I rode on in 1972 when my parents immigrated from the UK, and I got 2 deck chairs from the USS United States.
All right.
So I'm going to try and get to it before it goes down. Cool. And again, let's thank Steve. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I was so petrified.
Excellent. Did they, outstanding. Did they discover any bodies? Could you mention about the Syrians and
Hey, buddy.